There is a version of kindness that costs nothing. Not because it is effortless, but because it avoids something. It moves around the edges of things. It stays soft in places where firmness would require a kind of courage the person has not yet found in themselves. Most people never question it. Kindness is supposed to be good. It is one of the few things that almost everyone agrees on, and so it gets a kind of immunity, a pass from examination. But there is a specific kind of kindness that appears in the moments when something should be said and isn't, when a boundary should be drawn and isn't, when someone takes more than they were offered and nothing is done about it. That kind of kindness has a different quality to it. It is quieter than it looks. And underneath it, if you sit with it long enough, there is something that resembles relief. Not the relief of having helped someone, the relief of having avoided something. That distinction is small, but it changes everything. He had been in the same team for almost 4 years. He was known for being easy to work with, not in the way people say that about someone who is skilled and reliable, but in the softer sense. He never caused friction, he absorbed it. When a colleague was short with him, he found a reason to understand it. When credit was misattributed in a meeting, he let it pass. When the project timelines shifted and he was asked, not quite asked, more assumed to absorb extra work, he adjusted without making it visible. He told himself this was professionalism, maturity. There was a newer colleague. She had arrived with confidence. She spoke in meetings without the self-editing that he had trained himself into over years. She named what she needed. She acknowledged her own contributions directly and without apology. He noticed that people found her difficult at first. There was a period of adjustment, but over time, something settled. She became respected in the way that a person with clear edges tends to be respected. People knew where she stood, and so they knew how to stand near her. He watched this from a careful distance and told himself he was simply different, more considerate, less self-focused. But there were moments, brief ones, when he felt something tighten in him as he watched her speak plainly about something he had long ago decided to never speak plainly about. Something that felt close to resentment, though that word felt too large, more like a low, familiar ache. He did not look at it directly. There was a situation, eventually, where he was passed over for something he had been working toward quietly for nearly 2 years. No announcement, no explanation. It was simply decided and he was informed. He nodded, he said he understood. He said something generous about the person who had been chosen instead. In the car afterward, he sat in the parking structure for a long time before driving home. He was not angry exactly, but the feeling was close to something he recognized as loss, except it was not the loss of the opportunity. It was older than that, more layered. He could not name it yet. Step outside the story for a moment. There is something operating beneath the surface of what he did, not just in that final scene, but across the entire pattern of how he moved through his professional life. A logic that guided him quietly, long before any single decision was made. He believed, without having ever stated it, that goodness was protective. That if he remained accommodating, if he never demanded, never pushed, never made anyone uncomfortable, something would eventually reward that. Not in a transactional sense. He was not calculating. It was softer than calculation, more like a faith. A quiet arrangement with the world that said, if you do not threaten anyone, you will not be overlooked. And beneath that, if you are always pleasant to be near, you will be safe. He was not conscious of this. Most people who carry this assumption are not. It runs below the level of deliberate thought. It does not announce itself as a strategy. It feels from the inside simply like being a decent person, like taking the high road, like not making things harder than they need to be. It shapes small decisions first, whether to correct a misattribution in a meeting, whether to ask for something to be acknowledged, whether to say clearly that the balance here feels unequal. In each of those small moments, the assumption does its work. It says, that is not necessary, that is not who you are, let it pass. And then it shapes larger ones, not suddenly, gradually. The way a path forms not by design but by repetition, walked enough times in the same direction that it eventually looks like it was always there. The assumption is not cruel, it is not even wrong exactly. There are places where softness is genuinely the right response, and where restraint is the mark of someone who has learned not to react to everything. Those things are real. But this assumption had expanded beyond those places. It had moved into territory where it was no longer about wisdom, where it was functioning as something else entirely. A shield. And the thing about a shield is that it protects you from something, which means the person carrying it has decided at some level that the thing is dangerous, that the thing needs to be kept at a distance. He was protecting himself from something. The question the story leaves open, the one that sits in the parking structure with him, is what exactly he had decided was so dangerous that he spent years keeping it away. This assumption does not form in isolation. It is built in collaboration with environments that reward it, and most environments do reward it, at least in the short term, enough to make the assumption feel confirmed, enough to make it seem like evidence rather than avoidance. There are offices where the person who does not demand attention is described as humble, where the person who absorbs conflict without complaint is called a team player, where the person who never names their own contribution is considered gracious, mature, someone who does not need the spotlight. These descriptions are not entirely wrong, but they carry a secondary message, one that becomes internalized over time without ever being spoken out loud. They tell a person that accommodation is virtue, that visibility is a form of vanity, that asserting a need is, in some quiet way, a mark against character. And there are families that deliver the same message more directly. The child who caused the least disruption was the easiest to love. The one who stayed agreeable was the one who stayed safe. The one who asked for too much, too loudly, too persistently, that one learned quickly that asserting yourself had a social cost, that the room became colder, that the approval became conditional. None of this is dramatic. Most of it is ordinary. The mechanisms are small. A slight edge in someone's voice when a person speaks plainly about what they need. A warmth in the room when someone stays quiet and absorbs what is given. The particular approval that goes to the person who does not complicate things, and the particular coolness toward the one who does. These signals accumulate. They build a picture of what kind of person is safe to be. And over time, a person stops seeing the signals and just starts being the picture. He was liked, he was included, he was trusted. People spoke about him with a specific kind of warmth, the warmth reserved for people who do not threaten anything. That is real. Those are not small things. But it is a particular kind of recognition. It is the recognition given to someone who has made themselves easy to be near, who accepts what is given without negotiating what might be owed, who keeps the temperature of the room steady. And so the assumption calcifies. It is no longer a belief he holds. It becomes the atmosphere he moves through. Goodness becomes a strategy without feeling like one. Kindness becomes a posture without feeling like anything other than his personality. The behavior remains the same on the surface, but the relationship to it has shifted. It is no longer chosen, it is needed. There is something underneath the need, something the accommodation has been circling around for a long time. And the culture, by consistently rewarding the surface, has helped keep that something from ever needing to be faced. Friedrich Nietzsche observed something in human moral life that is easy to misread if you approach it looking for cynicism. He was not arguing that kindness is fake. He was not claiming that generosity is always a mask or that goodness is always a disguise for something worse. He was pointing at something more precise than that. He was pointing at the way certain moral values can be born from a position of weakness rather than strength, not from a genuine orientation toward others, but from the need to manage what feels threatening. He called this ressentiment. The word is French and it does not translate cleanly into English. It is not the same as ordinary resentment, which is conscious and directed. Ressentiment is quieter. It is a kind of moral inversion, a process by which a person, unable to engage with something directly, transforms that inability into a virtue. The person who cannot assert themselves reframes assertion as aggression. The person who cannot claim recognition reframes the desire for recognition as egotism. The person who cannot stand in the room with their own power reframes the avoidance of power as humility. None of this is deliberate. That is what makes it difficult to see. The reframe happens slowly beneath the surface, and by the time it has settled, it feels like a genuine value. It feels like who you are. In Nietzsche's view, the problem is not the kindness or the humility themselves. Those things, rooted in actual strength, are real. The problem is when they are doing different work than they appear to be doing. When they are not expressions of character, but defenses against a confrontation the person has decided they cannot survive. There is another idea that runs alongside this one. Nietzsche wrote about what he called the will to power, which is consistently misread as a desire to dominate, to overpower, to win at others' expense. It is not that. It is something more fundamental. It is the drive toward self-expression, toward becoming what you are, toward exerting your nature into the world in a way that is recognizable as yours. It is not aggression. It is something closer to presence. The willingness to take up the space that belongs to you, to let what you think and want and need be visible, not because you are demanding anything from others, but because you are not hiding from yourself. What Nietzsche noticed was that when this drive is suppressed, when a person has decided, for whatever reason, that self-expression is dangerous, it does not disappear. It redirects. It finds expression through the very framework that appears to be its opposite. The chronic accommodator is not without power. They are in a specific and unresolved relationship to it. The power is still present, it is simply managed inward, turned away from the world and directed at the self, expressed as restraint, as patience, as the daily discipline of not taking up too much room. This is not nothing, it requires effort, real effort. But the effort is going in a direction that protects an arrangement, not one that expresses a self. And somewhere in the gap between those two things, between the arrangement and the self, is where the ache lives. Look at the story again through this lens. He was not a kind person who was occasionally mistreated. That is the cleaner narrative. It is easier to hold, but it misses the structure of what was actually happening. He was a person who had made an arrangement with his own power, with his capacity to assert, to claim, to stand in a room as someone with edges and preferences, and a point of view that sometimes conflicted with other people's comfort. The arrangement was not spoken. It did not need to be. It operated through years of small decisions, each one deferring the moment when the arrangement might be renegotiated. The arrangement said, "I will keep this contained. I will make myself navigable. In exchange, I will not have to face what might happen if I were not." What might happen? That is the part that was never examined. The part that the accommodation was always moving away from carefully, like walking around something in the dark. Rejection, perhaps, the withdrawal of warmth. The discovery that being clearly himself, with needs, with a point of view, with limits, might make him less easy to include. That the liking was conditional in a way he had not wanted to test. The colleague who spoke plainly was not simply braver in a vague sense. She had, at some specific point, accepted a different kind of exposure. She had looked at the same risk, the friction, the misreadings, the possibility that she would make the room colder by being clear, and decided that the discomfort of being seen honestly was preferable to the slow numbness of being managed by others' expectations. The ache he felt watching her was not envy of her confidence as a personality trait. It was recognition. Something in him knew the shape of the decision she had made, because something in him had been avoiding that exact decision for a long time. The ache was the distance between where he was and where that decision lived. The moment in the parking structure is not grief over a missed opportunity. Opportunities come and go. What he was sitting with was older than any single outcome. It was the accumulated weight of years of being exactly what others found easiest to be near, and having called that goodness. Having believed that the arrangement was generosity when it was, at least in part, a form of self-erasure. The kindness was real. There is no reason to doubt that. The consideration for others was genuine. But it was doing more work than kindness alone can do. It was carrying the weight of an avoidance that had never been named, never examined, never given the chance to be understood on its own terms. And avoidances compound. They do not stay the same size. The longer they are carried without acknowledgement, the more weight they gather. Until a person sits in a parking structure, not quite angry, not quite grieving, circling something that still does not have a name. There is no reversal to recommend here. This is not the part where the understanding becomes a plan, where the realization crystallizes into an action, where a person walks back into that building the next morning with a new way of being. That is not how this works, and offering it as if it would be its own kind of dishonesty. What Nietzsche's lens provides is not a correction. It is a more accurate description of what has been happening. And sometimes that is all clarity is not a solution, but a more honest account of the situation you have actually been living in. The accommodation was a choice, every time. Chosen from a position that felt safer than the alternative, not freely chosen, perhaps chosen under the influence of a long-accumulated assumption, but chosen nonetheless. That is not an accusation. It is just the honest structure of what happened. The alternative was not cruelty. It was not self-promotion or aggression or a decision to stop caring about others. It was something simpler and considerably harder than any of those things. It was the willingness to be seen as a person who has needs, who notices when the arrangement is unequal and says so, who does not always absorb what comes toward them without acknowledgement. That willingness has a cost. The colleague paid it visibly. She paid it in the early friction, in the period when people found her difficult, in the meetings where her directness landed wrong, in the moments when speaking clearly made the room colder than it had been. And then it settled. The people around her adjusted. The respect that formed was a different kind, steadier, built on a more accurate picture of who she was. The cost of the other path is less visible. It does not appear in meetings or in the reactions of colleagues. It accumulates privately, in a tiredness that does not lift after rest, in a quiet, persistent feeling of invisibility that can grow in rooms full of people who like you very much, but who like a version of you that you have carefully maintained for their comfort. In moments alone where a familiar ache returns, and you still cannot quite name what it is about, only that it is not new, and that it has been there a long time. Both paths carry weight. The question is not which one is heavier. Both are. The question, if there is one, is which weight belongs to you. Which one you are carrying because you chose to, and which one you are carrying because you decided long ago that the alternative was too dangerous to risk. Those are different things, even when from the outside they look exactly the same. What looks like kindness from outside can look exactly the same as what fear looks like from inside. The difference is not visible in the behavior. It lives in the relationship between a person and their own capacity for power and what they have decided to do with it. Some things clarify slowly, not through argument, not through a sudden shift in understanding, but through the accumulation of moments like the one in the parking structure, moments that keep returning, a little more defined each time, until the person is finally ready to look at them directly. There is nothing wrong with gentleness. There is nothing wrong with choosing not to fight every battle or demand recognition for every contribution. But there is a difference between choosing that and needing it. And somewhere in the distance between those two things, in that small, quiet gap, is where a person begins to understand what their kindness has actually been protecting.